for new. And we're just looking for new people to join us the whole time. So, and we're particularly looking for a treasurer at the moment. So if anybody would like to offer their services, we'd be really grateful if you could join us. Just get in touch with me. So as you just heard, we're recording this debate and it will be placed on YouTube and Facebook. So if you don't want to be seen on it, if you could switch off your camera, but remain with the audio on. So, Di, do you think you could switch off your audio when you're not speaking?
Yep.
Brilliant, thanks. So, in the debates, we seek a balance between the speakers and contributions. So we do need to be strict with the timings. The next debate, we're hoping to go back to a live debate in person. Because it will be the first one, we don't want to take the financial risk of going back to Christchurch because that is expensive. So we're going to use the Quaker Meeting House. It'll be limited to 25 places. You can book on Eventbrite, and I'll be sending a link to that, but we will still have it on Zoom. So that's going to be in April, 23rd of April. And then following that, on the 21st of May, we're going to go back to Christchurch when we're having the Journeyman Theatre come perform a play about refugees, a really topical topic called The Bundle. So, back to present debate. Title is Disunited Kingdom, how much longer will the UK hold together? Sorry, Di, could you turn your volume off? I think there's some distortion coming.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Are you getting background or something?
Yes, we're getting background, yeah.
Is that better?
For the moment, yeah, let's just go with that.
We have some traffic noise outside. I can't do anything about that.
Okay.
Is that?
Thanks.
Yeah. Oops.
We're still getting some background noise, I'm afraid. So if everybody could turn it off when the volume off, mute when you're not speaking, that'd be great. Thank you. So our first speaker is Di Williams. So Di is a friend. I've known him for many years and very privileged to have known him. He's a chartered occupational psychologist, Quaker, and has researched into the use of depleted uranium in conventional warfare. And he's going to be speaking more as an individual, although you can probably guess where his roots come from the name. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Keith. Yes, it was kind to be invited for this. I don't have a political, at least I don't think I have a political view on this, but I've been interested in communities suffering conflict and trauma and change, and whether this is from wars or from local conflicts and so on. What I really wanted, in terms of maybe how a contribution to this discussion, is not so much about what I think, but about how all of us think about these topics and some ways of actually sort of framing our questions. So if I talk about me, I'm thinking that each of you will be listening in terms of your situation. So for example, if I say I was born in London, but I come from Welsh father and Liverpool mother with Irish connections, who were born in Palestine, I have an identity which is actually multi-layered. And to cut a long story short, I had a privilege of 18 months in Canada with my family about 30 years ago. And they had a different, because half the population were migrants, first or second generation, everybody was Canadian, but they also had an understanding that everybody was also their own ethnic identity, whether that was Russian or native Indian or Hong Kong or whatever. And these are not seen as mutually. The big problem we've had in Britain is that we come from a perhaps deeply racist tradition, very proud tradition, very multiracial tradition as it happens. And the contrast between Canada and the UK was quite stunning. I found the Canadian approach really helpful, which is it was okay to be Welsh and it was okay to be Canadian, if you see what I mean. And added to that was being British Columbian, in fact, because I was living in Vancouver. It was so multiracial. My children at school, they had a school show and they all came in their fancy dresses. And my son and his 10 classmates were all standing in 10 different national dresses. That was how diverse Vancouver was. So when I came back to the UK, it's a bit of a puzzle. Sometimes if we're living in leafy Surrey, it's mostly white, but I would guess about a third of our audience here are probably not necessarily British born, not necessarily white, all sorts of different identities. Even for those of us on here who have a British passport, we may relate, I can relate to London where I'm born, and I can relate to England where I live, but I have strong Welsh tendencies. You might be strongly Scots or strongly Irish and so on. And clearly Jane can talk about the Welsh. I'm not going to talk about Welsh as a specific thing. I do want to, but in terms of the possibility for this union holding together, somebody else can talk about the history of how it came together. The best thing about it, I think, is probably the rugby matches, because that's the time when we celebrate our individual identities in shared collective sport and entertainment and celebration. And I suppose that's my most positive approach to the UK. So I'm by and large, in as little letters, a unionist, but I totally respect the autonomy of each of the things. And I certainly would totally support a Scottish referendum, for example. And I'm most concerned about Northern Ireland because, so far as I see Brexit, Northern Ireland is no longer a viable part of the United Kingdom in terms of the conflict of economic loyalties between Southern Ireland and the mainland. I went to Northern Ireland so I must watch my time, hang on. In 1999, I went to Northern Ireland after the Omagh bomb, and I specifically was reaching out to meet people from both communities. And so I wound up being invited to have a tour of the Lower Falls Road and to walk into somewhere called Kelly's Cellar, which I would think was a fairly profoundly nationalist, Republican, however you call it, IRA-based centre. And my host at the other side, then when I was coming back, gave me a little memento from his community, which was an orange order tercentenary tea towel. So in the interests of national unity in Northern Ireland. I keep the tea towel in the glass and I put that in my cupboard, and I wish them all Godspeed. With this actually is not just a Northern Ireland thing. I used to go to a folk club in southern Woking 30 years ago. Somebody sung an Irish rebel song. Somebody behind the bar came from the other tradition in Northern Ireland, had a word with the landlord and said, I don't actually want to hear Irish rebel songs. Please, will you close this folk club? And they did. That was the end of the folk club. That was my first sense of racial disunity within our own community. Now that's 30 years ago. And I have very good friends on both sides of that debate. And there's so much peace work going in Northern Ireland, it's brilliant. Brexit to me was a challenge, and it raised another question, which is how do you actually look at these futures for England, for Britain, for United Kingdom, and also for Europe? And I just want to leave you with a suggestion. One of the ways I help my clients when we're looking at career planning to think about the future is not to try and think about the future, will it be the United Kingdom, but is to think in terms of scenarios, because there could be multiple futures. And if you use your hand as a scenario hand, your middle finger is that the next 10 years will be the same as the last 10 years. Your little ring finger is that things are going to get worse and there are more tensions. Your first finger is things get better. The little finger is that we have breakup and at least Northern Ireland goes, and possibly Scotland goes on a referendum. And the golden one is that we find a new unity post-Brexit, which has got more economic energy than it's had for the last 50 years. And I made a game about Brexit futures, which actually it looked at the different scenarios for the UK and for Europe. And you can use scenario planning, looking at any situation, and certainly looking at, for example, at the situation in Europe at the moment with Ukraine. And if you look for multiple futures, the future will be in your hands. It will be somewhere between the worst case and the best case. And it's important to think that wide, to try and think about multiple futures, because if you don't think about the most optimistic future, you can't have the courage to think about the worst future. And if you think about the worst future, it's really important not to get desperate about it, but to give yourself permission to think about the best future. So, for example, when Shell invented scenario planning back in the 1970s, they saw several futures for the oil industry in Europe. And they were trying to think whether they could invest in the North Sea. And they could see downside futures about union unrest in the UK and wars in the Middle East. But they thought there was a 15% chance of return of the good times. This is 1978. In 1979, Mrs. Thatcher was elected. And that's exactly what the scenario which did happen. What they missed is they didn't anticipate glasnost. So when the Soviet Empire collapsed in 1989, Shell had laid off most of its geologists, and they couldn't buy into the Siberian oil fields when they came on the market. So even Shell missed a golden future. Mind you, now BP would say, weren't you lucky? But can you see that? I hope that gives you an idea. It's just a way of thinking about uncertain futures. We don't have to get it right, but it really helps to try and keep an open mind to look at multiple futures. And then within that, there is my personal identity. Who do I belong to? Why do I care? Which groups do I belong to? What holds the UK together and what tears it apart? And these questions seem important to me, and I watch with interest and with encouragement to people. Don't panic, don't despair, but do keep options open and do talk to people who've got different perspectives and different priorities. I hope some of those ideas might be interesting, and I'd love to hear how the other speakers, the perspectives which you see on the future of the UK. Thank you.
Thanks, Di. That was a really interesting perspective. Jane, are you ready to talk to us now? Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Keith. And good morning, everyone, or should I say Bore da. And thank you for inviting me along to join your discussion today. When I was reflecting on the topic, I thought it might be quite useful, really. So in the title of the discussion, there is something about different voting systems. So I thought it might be useful just to give you an overview of the context that we're operating within here in Wales, because it is different to the English system. So I'm the leader of Newport City Council, and we're a unitary authority. So Wales has 22 unitary authorities. We don't have district councils in the same way that you do in England, but we do have a number of community councils, and we work closely with Welsh Government to deliver public services. Another difference between Wales and England is that we don't have elected mayors either. So what's really interesting is our government here in Wales. So the Welsh Government is formed by the majority party within our Senedd, our Welsh Parliament. But unlike the UK Parliament, the electoral system is partly based on proportional representation. And this is a really interesting, and somewhat challenging system to be part of. And it presents us, there are 60 seats in the Welsh Parliament, 40 of those are constituency seats, but the other 20, and they're based on a traditional first past the post mechanism, but then the other 20 regional seats are through an additional member system. And what that actually means is, I think, is two things, but interesting for this debate. So one is that by its very nature, it fosters a more collaborative approach to policy making and implementation, but also it makes it very difficult for any party to have really a significant majority to drive anything forward. So there has to be that collaboration. Now, currently, the majority of seats are held by Welsh Labour, but in order to deliver their programme for government, they formed a partnership with Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party, and they've come to some agreements around that in order to ensure that primarily that their budget is agreed and that those policies can be implemented. So that's how the system operates in Wales, and slightly different to the English system, and yet we are part of the UK Parliament as well. We have representation within the UK Parliament. So what you can see there is a system, I suppose, which to the ordinary person, the ordinary voter, could appear to be quite confusing, and I think that's something that we need to be mindful of. Well, when I was considering this particular debate, I really wanted to give some context. So to talk about my own city, and some of you on the call today may be familiar with the Chartists, the Chartist Rising. So I would say to you very proudly, the Newport is the home of democracy, in certainly modern democracy, and we're very proud of our history. We're located on the coast, so we've been a port city. We've experienced deindustrialization. In our communities, there are over 40 languages spoken. We're a really rich cultural mix. But actually, we're the gateway city to Wales, or the gateway city to England, depending on your perspective. And within that, we are quite anglicised. So that in itself is quite interesting. So when we talk about the Welsh culture and the Welsh history, there's probably less attachment to that in my area than perhaps in other areas of Wales. And I think that shapes the way people think about this as well. In terms of attitudes to Europe, 52.5% of voters in Wales voted to leave. And I'm saddened to say that is reflected in my own area as well. So my own area voted to leave Europe. And I recall at the time when there was some discussion around this, Lord Hayne actually saying something like, people have engaged with this, and we've seen a significant number of people engage with this in the short term. They might feel comfortable with it, but actually it's the long-term impact that people need to think of. And I think that's actually going to have an impact on the union here in the UK as our governments, our different governments implement their policies going forward. And I'm sure you're all aware of one policy that we've all been particularly interested in recently, and that's the Levelling Up White Paper. So we've all waited for the UK government to put this forward so that we know what the replacements will be. So how will the structural funds be replaced? Because we've got many areas that voted to leave the EU will need some sort of substitute funding there. And I think that's a real challenge, because I think, for me personally, we need to better understand why it is that so many people feel alienated and disenfranchised from the systems that we have in place, whether that's the hybrid system that we have in the Welsh context or the system for the UK parliamentary elections. Why do people feel so alienated from what's actually happening at the moment? Because we need to better understand that in terms of getting a better understanding of our collective future. Now, one of the things, certainly for me as a leader, one of the things that the last 2 years has really exposed are the levels of inequality within our communities here. We've got a really broad cultural base here in Newport, but oh my goodness me, the pandemic didn't just reveal income inequalities, it also revealed health inequalities. And some of our communities were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. For me, one of the questions around that is not just about the health issues, it's about the poverty, because many of those communities were people that had to continue to work through the pandemic because there would be no other source of income for them. And I think that increased their exposure. So we have to think about the impacts of poverty in relation to this whole idea of alienation as well, and the impact that that might have on us as a union overall. Very recently, and this is also a point that I'd like to raise in relation to this, I'm the Vice Chair of the Western Gateway, and this is an economic partnership with aspirations to be a powerhouse, and our partnership is fairly unique because it crosses, it's a cross-border partnership, England and Wales, and it goes from Swansea all the way to Swindon. We see the River Severn as something that joins us together, not as something that divides us. But one of the challenges that we've had, which relates specifically to this debate, is how we bring our governments together to support this, because what we want is to look outwards, not inwards, and we want those investors on a global scale to look at us and not see a division between England and Wales, but to see an area where investment will benefit the whole of the economic partnership. Because we really have to think about how we improve people's lives going forward, or support people to improve their lives and address these inequalities. And we have to, an important aspect of that has to be around how we achieve economic growth. So in relation to the union, I think this is really important because we spend a lot of time talking about this and thinking about our relationship with internally with each other, but how do we appear on a global platform? Next week, for example, one of the biggest investment conferences in the world is happening in France. The UK government will be there, Welsh government, many of our local authorities, many of our businesses. How do we appear collectively on that global platform? And I think sometimes we're distracted from that and we're looking inwards, and we need to look outwards. And for me, certainly I've tried to remain objective throughout my speech to you, but for me personally, that is by appearing united and appearing as one within the union, but recognising our differences. So I think I'll end there and look forward to engaging in the discussion with you going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. I did mean to introduce you, and apologies for that. Just want to repeat that, yes, Jane's got a really impressive number of posts that she is responsible for, that she alluded to, that being the Labour Council leader, Newport portfolio holder for strategic finance and economic growth, deputy chair, as she said, of the cross-border Western Gateway, and member of the Cardiff Capital Region Cabinet. So we're very grateful that you've given us your time. Thank you very much. I'd now like to pass on to Jonathan Lord, who's been the MP here at Woking since 2010. Won 4 elections in that post. Before that, he was Deputy Leader of Westminster Council and served on Surrey County Council for 2 years. Marketing was his career background and was a director of Saatchi & Saatchi and is a vice president of the debating group. I think that's still current. So welcome, Jonathan. Thank you.
Keith, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. So our disunited kingdom, you know, how much longer can our United Kingdom stay together? I think a deliberately provocative title, but not an unfair one. And I'm going to be coming at this from the position of a convinced unionist, someone who thinks that our United Kingdom is stronger together, economically, militarily, as a country, as a force of good, as a force for good in the world. But I think it is a question that bears close examination and discussion, and I will try and do that as dispassionately as I can in terms of laying out some of the background and some of my observations on this. But obviously, both during my opening remarks and certainly in the Q&A, my unionist sympathies will shine through, I imagine, because I feel them very strongly. It's wonderful to have 2 speakers with a Welsh background this morning, and let me. I'm going to start with Wales, make a few comments there, and then Scotland, and then Northern Ireland, and take it like that. The recent background in Wales, of course, is that in 1997, in the referendum, by a very, very narrow majority, the Welsh people voted for having a devolved Welsh Assembly. But I think the Assembly has settled in, and in the 2011 referendum on more powers to the devolved Assembly or Senate Parliament, as I think we now call it, there was a large majority, 63.5% of people voted yes to more powers, to more devolution for Wales. That's obviously a vote of the people in Wales. And more recently, we've had, in September 2021, we've had Mark Drakeford's Constitutional Commission to look at the constitutional settlement in Wales, and not necessarily just from a purely unionist perspective. I think he's tried to appoint people to that and given them a remit that can look in things in the round, and it'll be very interesting to see where that goes. In terms of public opinion in Wales with regard to our union and the relationship of Wales to the rest of our United Kingdom, for many years, for decades, only 10% of people in Wales, in opinion poll after opinion poll, only 10% said that they wanted independence in the short or long term. So massively outweighed by those who favoured the union with the rest of the United Kingdom. But that's been slightly, that's getting less the case now. So more recent opinion polls, literally over the last year or so, I think the most recent one perhaps gives a good flavour. So in the most recent poll, Don't knows were 26% on the question of the union. 53% favoured staying in the United Kingdom, and 21% favoured independence. And that was, if you looked at the cross-tabulation of that poll, it was the younger age groups in particular that were more minded to say that they would favour independence. So still a large majority in favour of staying in the union, but the vote, the opinion polls for independence ticking up from 10% in the past to more recently around the 20% level. And of course, that's and given that it's the younger age groups that were more minded towards independence, obviously just some seeds of worry there for unionists. And I would pose this conundrum, particularly with regard to Wales and Scotland. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I think my Conservative colleagues, including those in government, are wrestling with this, convinced unionists as we are. And that is that that more recently in Wales, under Mark Drakeford, in particular, but our Welsh panelists might have a stronger view on this. My impression is that he, more than previous Welsh leaders, first ministers, has been in favour of more devolved power in potentially quite a big way. And here's my conundrum for everyone to have a think about. It's perhaps always in the interest of those in power, and Keith said how I was a local councillor before I became an MP. It's normally in the interest of those in power to accrue yet more powers. You know, they always think that the body that they sit on, whether they're a local councillor or in Parliament, or perhaps in a devolved, in this case in a devolved assembly or Parliament, whether for self-interest or indeed because you persuade yourself or you're convinced that it's in the wider interest that your particular Parliament or your particular body should have more power. So we've given more and more powers to Wales and to Scotland, and it's always in the interest of the First Minister and the government there to want more powers. And we've seen Labour, I think, moving in a very visibly in the direction of wanting more powers. But the question here and the conundrum here is that good for the union? If the input and say of the rest of the United Kingdom is only going in one direction, less and less and less, does that not potentially sow the seeds for people who want to take that final step, irreversible step potentially, from lots of devolved powers to full independence and to split up what I believe is our precious United Kingdom. So I think that's a huge conundrum. If we turn to Scotland, obviously the background here is that there was a substantial majority of the Scottish people for a Scottish Parliament in the referendum of 1997. But the vote on independence was obviously lost by effectively 55 to 45 in the 2014 referendum. But a lot of things obviously have changed since 2014. We seem to have, not only in Scotland, but perhaps the rest of the United Kingdom, we seem to have packed about 25 years of normal politics into the last 6 or 7 or 8 years. So let's have a look at where Scotland is now. So the polls have been up and down on independence. In recent months, no to independence has been ahead in most recent polls in Scotland, and indeed it's even very close on whether even to have another Scottish referendum. So the Scottish people are divided pretty evenly on whether even there should be another referendum within the next 10 or 15 years, or indeed at all. so a little bit of comfort to unionists like me that no is ahead in the polls on the referendum question, but there have been a series of months over the last couple of years, in particular, where yes has had a narrow lead. So it is the polls are too close to call on the question of independence in Scotland. One interesting thing is that if the question is posed differently, so rather than just a yes/no to independence, with independence having the yes vote, interestingly, if you ask the question in a different way and say, to Scottish people in an opinion poll, do you think that Scotland should remain in the UK or leave the UK? Because of the way the question is asked, that shows a much bigger majority for remain. So the polls on a yes/no question are very close, but should you remain in the UK or leave the UK, which is effectively the sort of question, even-handed question, that we posed with regard to the EU referendum, showed a much bigger majority for remain, up to 15%. So certainly unionists like me would like to have that sort of even-handed question rather than a straight yes/no question to independence, with yes being the positive answer, if you like, that nationalists can put on their banners and placards. As I was saying, a lot has changed since 2014, since the independence referendum. In particular, the economic case for independence, I think, has reduced markedly. So in the Indie ref, the nationalists, the SNP, were able to point to very big remaining oil revenues, and a lot of their economic projections was based on the huge amounts of money that they would come into a Scottish treasury if they were the only ones to have North Sea oil and gas. But obviously there's been a big decline in production since then, and despite the recent price rises, the economic case of Scotland getting a huge oil and gas windfall is not at all secure. And it's also, of course, the fact that the UK has now left the EU, and given that most of Scotland's trade is with the rest of the UK rather than other countries abroad, even the EU, if Scotland went independent, then if there were trade barriers, and they say, for example, they want to join the EU or rejoin the EU at the earliest opportunity if they became independent, that's the case that the SNP make, then of course there's a serious conundrum for Scotland's economy and trade, because if they are a member of if they manage to rejoin the EU, there would then be a barrier between Scotland, potentially, well, almost certainly, even if the rest of the UK was generous and wanted a brilliant trade deal with Scotland, you would have an EU country on one side of Hadrian's Wall and the rest of the UK on the other, with all the barriers to trade that might come about. Yes.
Sorry, Jonathan,
are we almost up?
Yes, I'm afraid so. Yes.
Okay, I tell you what, let me just say one brief word in Northern Ireland, just to set the picture there, and that is that there's still a reasonable majority in Northern Ireland for keeping our union, and of course that's helped by the fact that many Catholics in Northern Ireland have a preference to stay in the UK, even if they don't themselves identify as unionists or British. There might be demographic movements there in Northern Ireland towards joining the Republic, a gradual growth of the Catholic population compared to the Protestant population. But of course, we've also got there the thorny issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the maintenance of the Good Friday Agreement post-Brexit, and we can discuss that in questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. And that brings me on to questions. Yes, so if you do have questions, I'm sure there is going to be a lot. It would be good if you could put them into chat, and then I will go through them and bring them to the panel. So on to the last speaker, Philip Goldenberg. He's a solicitor. He advised the Liberal Party on its merger with the SDP and co-authored the original constitution of the Liberal Democratic Party. In a Guardian article in 2010 was entitled "My Local Hero, Philip Goldenberg," by a Conservative MP, Jonathan Gianogli. Right, thank you, Philip. So, and an ex-working councillor. So over to you, Philip.
Well, thank you, Keith. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to everybody for coming. Can I say thank you to the previous speakers? Guy, I really related to about his point about multiple identities. Mine are Woking, Dorset, London, and British, obviously, European Jewish, and above all Ukrainian, where most of my ancestry comes from. It feels at the moment, to paraphrase Lady Eaton, that Dnieper is flowing through my back garden. And I also agree very much with Jane on looking outward. Jonathan, I share with Jonathan, I'm a strong unionist, but what he's managed to do and what he said is ignore the two massive elephants in the room, which are pushing towards the breakup of the United Kingdom. And they're these. First of all, there's the stupidity of Brexit. It's a massive self-inflicted economic damage. Our trade is down 15%. Business, farmers and fishermen have all been left, I say, washed up on dry land, particularly in the latter case. It's a geopolitical disaster. It was supported by Trump and it was supported by Putin, who supported Brexit. And that was part of his bid to damage the unity of Europe. And that's probably one of the factors which led him to feel he could invade Ukraine in the way we've seen. That's the first factor. The second is the transformation of the Conservative Party into a nasty, populist English national party, led, as so often with such parties, look at Trump, by a chancer, a charlatan, and a serial shameless liar. And it's no wonder that decent Tories like Michael Heseltine, David Gauke, Ken Clarke, and Dominic Grieve are so horrified. Remember what Einstein said in Berlin in the 1930s. Nationalism is an infectious disease like measles. And one of the interesting consequences of the pandemic is we've been able on national TV, unlike ever before, to draw the contrast between devolved and national leaders. Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford have both come across as honest, decent, and reasonable people doing their best in a difficult situation. There's a contrast. I want to take you back now to a little anecdote of mine from 2016, the referendum. I trot off to the annual budget session run by my rather good tax accountants in Cobham. And up turns a local Tory MP who does a presentation on the budget, which is fair enough, takes questions and everything, and the whole thing segues into Europe. So I eventually put my hand up and say to him, look, if Brexit happens, you will create more pressure for Scottish independence, and you'll do enormous damage to the fragile and nascent peace process in the island of Ireland. Apart from the fact he looked as if he could murder me on the spot and took me off his Christmas card list, it was apparent he had not thought about either issue. They caved him totally new. And that is the person who ended up as Foreign Secretary, God help us, and then Justice Secretary, which just shows this cabinet is mixed up of either Brexiteers who are by definition certifiable or shameless careerists going along for the ride. I'll leave you to judge which Boris is, probably a bit of both. Scotland, we've dealt with Wales, thanks for input. Scotland has a much stronger civic society than England. It is, as Jonathan noted, pro-EU membership, and it would be mad for it to go independent. But a Boris Johnson government of an obnoxious English National Party is driving towards that independence. It may not be economically sensible, indeed it's economically bonkers, just as Brexit was economically, but emotions can take over from economic judgment. I absolutely agree with Jennifer's posting in chat, incidentally, and I'm a liberal, I'm a builder of bridges, not walls, so I want the union to stay. We now need to get on to Northern Ireland, which is really, really important and deserves fuller treatment. The Northern Ireland Protocol was a disaster. Boris Johnson flagrantly lied to the Democratic Unionists in saying it would not cause difficulties in trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. About as big a lie as a referendum campaign, extra 350 million quid for the National Health Service. And in this context, while people narrowly voted for Brexit to leave the EU political institutions, they did not vote for the economic stupidity of leaving the single market and the customs union. And that's caused all the problems in Northern Ireland. Incidentally, in the course of the referendum, Boris Johnson said we would stay in both the customs union and the single market. So what you're seeing in Northern Ireland economically is trade with Great Britain is going massively down and trade with the Republic is going massively up. And Northern Ireland politics are without doubt moving towards the unification of the island of Ireland. It is likely in the upcoming Assembly elections in May that Sinn Féin will come first, and there will therefore be constitutionally a Sinn Féin First Minister. Unionist voters are nowhere near as hung up on the Northern Ireland Protocol as are the Democratic Unionists, who are desperately going more and more extreme in order to fight off the even more extreme people. It's a bit like the Tory party absorbing UKIP, incidentally described by Cameron as loonies, fruitcakes and closet racists, but they've now taken over the Conservative Party. My friends in the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, our sister party, are likely to come third or even second. And my instinct is that Irish unification is likely within 10 years. Maybe wrong on that, but I think that's where it's moving. So here is the paradox. Jonathan, like Dominic Raab, sits as a Conservative and Unionist member of Parliament. But the consequences of Brexit and the consequence of the change in the nature of the Conservative Party will in all probability lead to the disunited Kingdom of England and maybe Wales. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Jonathan, would you like a quick reply before we go on to questions?
So yes, well, Philip, great brio as ever, and obviously I reject the notion that the Conservative Party has turned into some sort of what did he call it, a narrow, nasty English nationalist party. We remain convinced unionists, and I find it odd that Philip said nasty things about nationalism itself. Well, patriotism, which is the good face of nationalism, is showing itself in Ukraine, and what people will do to defend a sovereign democratic nation. I'm happy to deal with some of the Brexit angles in questions. Obviously, it's posed some interesting new questions for the union. But as I say, in terms of Scotland, of course, it makes the economic case for Scotland leaving the UK even worse than it was before, because of the barriers that would then almost certainly follow.
Thank you very much. Right, on to questions, and we've got a couple of comments. Well, one comment so far. Jennifer, would you like to say that yourself? Introduce it yourself? Would you like to unmute and or I can read it if Okay, shall I read it out then? So Jennifer says she can't connect. So if I read it out, I want to believe in a future for the United Kingdom. But one of the reasons that Brexit so undermined that future in the context of Scotland specifically was that it was an act of bad faith to the Scottish people following the Scottish independence referendum, when a prominent plank of the pro-unionist argument was that independence would mean losing EU membership. Then the English majority voting for leaving the EU has taken their membership away anyway. So Brexit has in fact undermined the unionist cause. Right, so could we have some comments? Jonathan, do you want to speak first or last on this?
Yes, no, I think that is a very good point. And I think it does, I think it is a case that, I think it is the strongest case that the nationalists have to reopen the live question of a further independence referendum. That obviously the 2014 independence referendum was set under very different conditions, as I mentioned in my opening remark. And of course, in the question it says, you know, and I fully acknowledge that Scotland voted strongly for Remain. Although, of course, England and Wales, it wasn't just the English that voted for Brexit, it was the Welsh narrowly voted for Brexit as well. So that part of the question was slightly wrong. Look, you know, I you know, as someone who believes in sovereignty and democracy. If most, you know, if a majority of Scots want to be independent, then it's their, you know, it's their democratic right ultimately for them to take that decision. And I think it is a moot question as to whether the fact that Brexit has now happened has so changed the terms of that debate that the Scots should be given another, you know, the Scottish nationalists, those who want to take our United Kingdom apart. I think it is a moot point whether they should get another crack at that at some point over the next 5 or 10 years. And you know, but as I say, there isn't a majority in the opinion polls at the moment for that, nor is there a majority for Scottish independence. So I think personally, I think if there was a majority, a solid majority in Scotland, you know, repeated opinion polls saying 55% or more of Scots want a referendum and they want it within a particular time frame, I think that would probably say that we should acknowledge that and give another referendum. I think I'm personally convinced that the unionists would win that argument. As I say, economically, it was always illiterate for the Scots to go for independence. They would be worse off for the reasons that I outlined in my opening remarks. And of course, one other thing that perhaps we should just put on the table, because I'm not sure any speakers so far have, and that is that that Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, but particularly Scotland and Northern Ireland, are of course beneficiaries from the Barnett formula. So more gets spent per head in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales than it is in England. And it's not small amounts. We're talking about over £1,000 more spent per capita in Wales, £2,000 more per capita spent in Scotland, £2,300 per capita spent more in Northern Ireland. So just in those strict government budgetary terms, those countries, if they did seek independence, or in the case of Northern Ireland to unify with the Republic, they would be net losers to the tune of approximately £2,000 a head. And of course, that's not including that as less affluent parts of our United Kingdom, they also contribute less to the Treasury as well. So there would be less taxes there for them to make up that generous public spending per head. And that would obviously come to the fore in any independence referendums.
Thank you, Jonathan. Any of the other panel want to respond? Philip?
I agree with Jonathan Lord. He may be alarmed by this. It was economically innumerate for the Scots to vote for independence. It still would be. But it was economically innumerate for the UK to vote for Brexit. And what happened is emotions overcame economic logic. And there's a serious danger that will do so again in Scotland, however economically unwise it may be. The second point is, whatever may be the truth about the Barnett formula, I'm sure Jonathan is right on this, he omits to mention, conveniently, the amount of European funding that Brexit has lost for the nations and regions of the United Kingdom, and which to his government promised to make up and has spectacularly failed to do so.
Thanks. Jane, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of those points. And I've tried really hard to remain objective, but there are a few points that I would like to make in relation specifically to the Barnett formula. So what that doesn't reflect is the inequality across the UK, and I think it's really important to take that into account, and many areas that have suffered from deindustrialisation that have never recovered from that. So that is really critically important, and as Philip said, that's rightly compounded by leaving the EU and the loss of EU funding. And there's two things I'd like to share with you, because you probably won't be aware of this, or as aware of it as we are from a Welsh context. And that is, we've got a Secretary of State for Wales who only last week was quoted as saying, and who gave an interview to Times Radio, who said he didn't know what the Barnett formula was until he became the Secretary of State for Wales, which you might think is a reasonable point to make, except for the fact that he's an MP within Wales who's represented a constituency in West Wales for quite some time. So there is a little bit of alarm around that. Certainly, in more recent times, especially in relation to the pandemic and the distribution of consequential funding via the Barnett formula, in relation to aspects of expenditure that UK government has made, Wales has not benefited from the way that it should have through the formula. And I think it's important to point that out too. What I'd really like to go on to though, and I did mention this, but I do think it's important, is levelling up, the levelling up white paper, the implications of the levelling up white paper for the rest of the UK, and what that means in terms of the substitution or replacement of resources that we would have had from the EU. And the very real impact on the ground from this is that I've got around 40 staff who are paid via EU funding streams at the moment, with no indication of how they will be paid in future. But their role is critical because they're very skilled, very experienced, and they help get people into work. Now, there's no certainty around that at all. That's not just the case for me, but for many other local authorities, and not just in Wales, but also within the English context as well. So what exactly does the UK government mean by levelling up? That's the point that I'm trying to make, because the levelling up white paper and any actions that follow on from that, particularly any funding, will also impact on this debate in terms of the future of the union, because that could also be a driver that potentially unites or divides. And it's really important that we have some degree of clarity around that and what that actually means for the future. And I'd also like to make a point that many of you will be unaware of in relation to the distribution of resources via the Community Renewal Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, and that is it deliberately tries to undermine democratically elected government. So in my own case, it totally excludes the Welsh Government and seeks to establish a relationship directly between UK government and local authorities. So whether it's the UK government, therefore, driving that wedge and further increasing that desire for independence remains something that we'll have to look at more closely in future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Do I have anything to add?
So can I just pose a little question there? Because I think that in my opening remarks, I said that this conundrum that, you know, devolved parliaments, devolved assemblies, any body wants to accrue over time more power to itself for either self-interested or disinterested, the right reasons, because you know, that's human nature, and that's the nature of institutions. But Jane said, you know, is saying there, you know, that the UK government, you know, shouldn't really have a direct relationship with local councils in Wales, and I think seems to be taking that current Welsh argument from the Welsh Labour Party, that they want more devolution, more powers to the Senedd, and, you know, less and less powers or money given directly by the UK. But if you don't have that direct relationship between the UK government and the people of Wales and its councils and so on, aren't you? My view is that increases the nationalist independence tendencies rather than sating them.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jane, do you want a quick reply?
I'd just like to say that the areas of expenditure this funding would be spent on are areas that are within the fields of devolved responsibility for the Welsh Government. So it's important to acknowledge that. So in terms of the policy, government policy, the implementation of government policy, that's where the money is being taken from. So it's important to be aware of that.
Okay, I think we're at the end there. Ian has got a question. Ian Johnson, would you like to ask us the question yourself, Ian?
Yeah, I did put it in chat, but really it was Jane. Don't know how she found the time, by the way, to be here with all her roles. And, congratulate her for that, and very impressive, actually, as indeed all our speakers have been. But I was interested in Jonathan's point about opinion polls and how there's a shift at the minute towards separation amongst certain sections of the Welsh community. And I don't want to put, you know, too much on a poll or polls, but I just wondered, with Jane in the middle of all this and with her cross-border working with Swindon, I just wondered how she felt that the reason might be for that, given that, you know, well, the Welsh don't traditionally feel particularly separate from us. At least I don't like to think they do, but that's my nature, I guess. But I just wondered if she had a feel for where the movements are there, which may make people wish to feel separate from England or the UK, whichever you wish to call it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I think that's a really, really important question. And I don't think that we can discount the role of the media in shaping people's thoughts as well. So if you think about the Brexit campaign and how that helped to shape people's thoughts, but also this populism, this growing populism, and it's everywhere, isn't it? People are continuously exposed to that. I was really interested in Jonathan's point about the demographic distribution, because I think that's quite important as well. So is it about people possibly not seeing a future for themselves as part of the union? There is a growing wave within Wales of support for independence. Personally, I don't think I would agree that it doesn't make economic sense. So But there is a growing wave, and I think part of that is related to this an alienation that we need to better understand, and I don't think that we've got to grips with that at all at the moment. But I do feel very strongly, though, going back to the points that you made about some of the other activities that I'm involved in, we really need to think about how we're viewed on a global platform. And if we want economic growth and prosperity, which is what's going to help us, particularly now we're no longer part of the European Union, if the driver is towards economic growth and prosperity, we need to think about how the world is viewing us, you know, and stop looking inwards and start looking outwards. And on that, we need to present a united front. We need to present ourselves to the world as though there aren't any divisions between our governments, because we want investors to invest here. And I don't think we're quite there yet either, Ian. You know, it's something that we need to continue to work on. So I think the best argument for the union at this point is about economic growth and prosperity and the strength that we will have collectively. But I liked, I was very interested with in what Di was saying about Canada. And throughout this discussion, it's occurred to me, I've been thinking, you know, is it the electoral system that we operate within the UK? Would people feel more engaged with it if we had a different system? Could we move to a federal model in future? Is that something that might suit this and satisfy people's desires? There are, I think, potential solutions that are worthy of exploring in future.
Can I make a further contribution here, Keith? I think it has been mooted that in both Wales and Scotland, you know, the first ministers, at least for much of the past 2 years, were seen to have had a good COVID war. So, you know, there they were, you know, just like, you know, there Boris was at the lectern in Downing Street. What most Welsh and Scottish residents and voters were seeing was the Welsh First Minister and the Scottish First Minister, you know, at their podiums, you know, guiding their nations, you know, being seen to do that, you know, every weekday afternoon at 5 o'clock. And of course, you know, I think most of us would accept that the major schemes that helped us through COVID, whether it was the furlough scheme or the amazing vaccination procurement program, those were UK-wide. They were driven by the UK government. And of course, the UK government, with its scientific and medical advisors, were also at the forefront of taking the major decisions in terms of lockdowns and potential COVID restrictions. And then the Scottish and Welsh governments just made them a little bit harsher, a little bit firmer. But the main direction was from the UK government. And we occasionally got the impression in England, I don't know whether anyone would have a view on this, that, you know, perhaps the Scottish and Welsh governments were just changing things slightly, almost for the sake of it, for being a little bit different. But the main thrust came from the UK-wide medical and scientific establishment and their advice to government. And that comes back to my point. Let's wind back, you know, 30, 40 years in history. We had the most senior Labour politicians in the land saying that, you know, obviously Scottish nationalists always wanted independence, and they wanted a Scottish Parliament as a stepping stone to independence. But we had for several decades, we had senior Labour politicians effectively saying, and indeed one of them literally saying, that devolution will kill Scottish nationalism and independence stone dead. And of course it didn't. And we now have we've had a nationalist government in Scotland desperate for independence for many, many years. Despite objectively the Scottish government delivering less well in terms of health outcomes and education outcomes than the UK Parliament have done and the government have done for England. So it comes back to this conundrum of, I don't think that you kill nationalism and independence by giving more and more and more powers and devolution. I would find it, I'd be very interested if someone could put the argument to prove or show to me that I'm wrong, that actually more devolution, more powers, more First Ministers standing at their own podiums, and people in Wales and Scotland feeling further apart from their UK-wide government, how that doesn't ultimately fan the flames of nationalism and independence.
Thank you, Jonathan. Philip, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Jane, thank you so much for that input. It's helpful. I agree with you. The electoral system in England and nationally is a disgrace. And it's maintained there deliberately and corruptly. And I agree we need a proper federal structure. On Wales, I tread with hesitation on your territory. It always struck me that Welsh nationalism is primarily cultural. And the geopolitical economics of Wales seems to me, and a friend of mine at Oxford wrote a DPhil thesis on this, so I'll rely on him, that all the links are lateral. So South Wales links through to Bristol, Mid Wales through to Shropshire, North Wales through to Chester and then Liverpool. And the communications north-south within Wales are much less good than the lateral communications into those three areas of England. But let me pick you up on your point of alienation. Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, and the Dutch have always been enormous supportive friends of the United Kingdom, said after the Brexit referendum that Britain was not only constitutionally and economically broken, but also socially broken. And I think he was right. One of the things that happened after the referendum was a massive spike in hate crimes. And that was the foreseeable consequences of the politics of emotion and identity used by the Leave campaign, overtaking rational, logical, Enlightenment, evidence-based policies. And that with an intolerance of dissent. Just remember, the Daily Mail calling British judges enemies of the people. You'd expect to find that in a communist country, not in here. And of course, mind you, that was a Daily Mail, which in the 1930s supported Mosley and thought Hitler was a good chap.
Thanks. We really do need to go on to some other questions. I think we could spend the debate on this question alone. Irene has a question. Would you like to say it yourself?
Yes, I don't think most people are aware of the relationship we have with the Republic of Ireland. It's covered legally under the Common Travel Area, I think it's called. But actually, it means that Irish citizens have all the rights in Britain as English citizens and vice versa. It's not something that's talked about. It's a symbiotic relationship. And I just wondered whether any of our speakers had ever considered, rather than us all splitting up, all joining together and forming a sort of, United States of the British Isles, or the British and Hibernian Isles, as probably the Irish would prefer. Yeah, let's all join together rather than split up, but in a federated way, so that just like in the United States, people get a fair say in what happens.
Let me come in first briefly on that. I think it's a lovely thought, but I don't think you would find in the Republic of Ireland, the southern part of Ireland, that there would be support for a strong federation in which, by sheer force of numbers, and so people often say that our United Kingdom is unbalanced because England obviously is such a large proportion of the whole. But I don't think you'd get Republic of Ireland politicians or the people there to buy into a federated British Isles. I don't think.
Thanks. Di, we haven't heard from you. Any thoughts for a while? Can you unmute?
Yep. That's a very intriguing idea, Irene. It does touch on the point I've been wondering through all these earlier comments, that we've been looking inwardly for the most part about what happens within the United Kingdom in terms of tendencies to break up or whatever. All of this is going on in the wider context of Europe, and I'm not thinking of it in Brexit terms now. I'm thinking of it in political and economic terms. And in my scenarios for Europe, when I was looking at this before Brexit in 2019, the scenario about UK leaving was a scenario called loss of a friend, loss of UK market cooperation, etc. But then the downside ones for Europe were factions in decline, collapse of the euro, splitting, more countries wanting to leave, and kind of internal conflict. And the nightmare scenario is actually now happening, which was Beast from the East, which was the nightmare scenario with the potential for UK breakup and Russia returns. Now, in that European context, the danger is if we wind up, if you combine the UK scenarios, the downside UK scenario was rough ride was trade and the pound drop, you get increasing poverty, you wind up with plunder of national assets by global predators, and you wind up eventually with this leading to various kinds of social and political turmoil. And then the economic collapse one, which suddenly comes back as a serious possibility with the double whammy of COVID and Ukraine, which is that the pound crashes, services collapse, you get social unrest and chaos, you get all sorts of disruption because you've got large numbers of, we've just invited 100,000 Hong Kong refugees, and now we might have something between 1,000 and perhaps 10 or 15 from Ukraine, in areas which have already got serious economic problems. There's a danger of something this is absolutely fertile territory for the right, and I think they will be very soon will be whipping up serious discontent. So you wind up with a nightmare scenario within the UK of the UK breaking up. So the combined, if you combine the UK worst case scenarios with the European worst case scenarios, you wind up with a lose-lose outlook for both UK and Europe, which, coming back to what somebody was it Philip saying earlier on, which is exactly what Trump and Putin wanted 20 years ago. Yeah. So we need to look in the wider context, and within that context, the imbalances, for example, within England of the regions, because at the moment you have this massively powerful government in London, which is the English nationalist fortress, and the other ones hanging around the edges and taking what crumbs are sort of handed out from the middle. Whereas if the regions had devolution there, the proper balanced devolution gives greater cohesion. And what you're moving on to is that you have a dynamic equilibrium where the forces pulling people together are stronger than the ones which tend to be trying to pull them apart.
Thank you. Jane, have you any thoughts about Ireland and Federation?
I think that we really need to seriously explore some of these options moving forward, and we do, because if I think it comes back to the point about economic growth. There has to be some degree of unity between us in order to present ourselves on that global platform. And Di is right. How do other countries perceive us? You know, what do they see when they look at us? I also want to follow on from Di's point really about community cohesion and the potential impact on community cohesion. We need to be mindful of this and the impact that the current economic and political context can have on this. In my own area, I've got 20,000 people within my own local authority area who are seeking sanctuary through one form or another, whether that's through the settlement scheme that we're part of, or other avenues. 20,000 people from different countries around the world currently seeking sanctuary in my area. I want them to feel safe here, and the rhetoric that's developing around this is really of great concern to me, because I want to build community cohesion and not to be engaged in anything that is divisive or has a detrimental impact on those people's lives. So we really do need to think about how we move forward with some degree of unity. Now, I totally reject the notion that the UK government showed strong leadership during the pandemic, and I know that's not a debate for now, but I do reject that totally. And we do need to explore other models in order to prevent any further fragmentation. And if we take a mature approach to democracy and engage in a thoughtful and considered way, without trying to make you know, crass political points, then actually we might develop an approach that we could all sign up to. But we do need to start to think about this and think about it seriously going forwards.
Thank you. Philip, do you want to say something?
Yeah,
brief?
I mean, I don't want to alarm Jonathan by agreeing with him again, but I mean, it was very clear when Irish independence was achieved 100 years ago, the Irish opted not to be part of the Commonwealth. They retained historic, they can vote here, and there's a free travel area, but they don't want to be part of a British Isles Federation. I think and I'm by and large a federalist, but it's going to be, but you will end up, in my view, with Irish unification, at which point you have the island of Ireland as an entity within the European Union. You have England and presumably Wales outside the European Union, and Scotland could be either side. You can't really have a political federation which is half in and half out of the European Union. It simply doesn't work. Incidentally, if you ever did have a federal solution, which I'm in favour of massively, for, let's just take the current United Kingdom, you could not have England as an entity because it is so large. You would have to have a federation of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, if that's the case, and the English regions, because that's the only way you could get a balanced outfit.
Thank you. We are coming towards the end now, but we've got one outstanding question in the chat. And I know some people have been raising their hands, but unfortunately, we don't have the time to take all the questions and all the comments. But the question that I'd like to leave us with, and the speakers to give their final thoughts, is the question: we have parliaments for Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, but there is no parliament for England. Should we have one? So if you could answer that and give us your final thoughts. Thank you. And can we start with Philip this time, please?
No. I mean, it comes back to my point on the previous question, that England is so much the larger part that a parliament for England is the wrong answer. You can only run a sensible structure on a federal basis if you use the English regions instead of England as a single country. And if you do that, you don't need an English parliament.
Thank you. Jonathan, if you'd like to.
So yes, I'm inclined to agree with that. The England, in terms of population and economic power, is such the larger partner in our United Kingdom that once you have an English Parliament, that probably fans the flame for independence, because you don't have the uniting force of a UK government doing key things on economic policy, etc., etc. The only UK Parliament that you'd effectively have left would be to be running foreign and perhaps defence affairs. All of the rest of the domestic legislative agenda would effectively have been devolved to the four nations of the United, the four nations or provinces of the United Kingdom, and I think that ultimately leaves us weaker. And it would be a thin thread that our United Kingdom dangled by if the only thing we had in common was our foreign policy, our defence policy, and a shared monarchy. So for that reason, I'm like Philip. I don't think an English Parliament is the answer. I'll say one other thing. I didn't want the whole the whole morning and early afternoon to be a relitigation of Brexit. Obviously, Brexit has cropped up. I mentioned it in my opening remarks as well. But a relitigation, I don't think is helpful. What we do need, given that decision was taken for Brexit, we obviously need to forge a strong relationship with the European Union, so that those who voted Remain, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, feel that we're playing the sort of positive global role that we can and should. And I think we've shown that over Ukraine. The British government and our country is regarded by Ukrainians as being the country that has helped them the most. Very, very clear. And I think also, as we seek a good future relationship with the EU itself needs to accept that Brexit has happened and to try and forge that new friendship with us. It was most unfortunate, for example, that they tried to invoke, was it Article 16, to try and take our vaccine and not allow vaccines to come to us. And this was crass stuff. But I think this dreadful situation with Russia invading Ukraine has brought the Western world together in a way that we've not seen perhaps in a generation. I think our alliances were fraying at the edges. So let's, in this dreadful situation, let's come together, but let's then build on that for future success and strong relationships between all Western democracies.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Jane, so remembering about the original question, which was, should there be an English Parliament to go with the other parliaments, and your final thoughts as well, please.
I think I'd agree with Philip and Jonathan really in relation to that. I wouldn't view there necessarily being that much to be gained from an English Parliament, especially as the regions are stronger within England because you've got elected mayors, and there's an opportunity to actually strengthen the regions in that way rather than through separating it out with an English Parliament. But I do think that we very strongly that we should view ourselves as global citizens and really think about our place in the world and how the world views us, and also really start to think about how we move forwards and establish a modern democracy that, whilst we may disagree with each other ideologically, we can support in terms of the democratic process.
Thank you very much. And finally, Di.
It's an interesting. It's not so much should there be an English Parliament. I think certainly the constitutional reform within the UK hasn't stopped. It's only just started, if you like. When we were in the EU, life was so much easier because you had an economic level playing field between all the regions and other parts of the United Kingdom with all of our surrounding environment. It's much more complicated than the Brexit thing. And that instability is going to stay, unreliable for a while to come. But within that, we have simply so got to, taking Jonathan's point, which is we are where we are. We are where we are, but the English, particularly electoral system, political system, is catastrophically bad, and it needs the immediate thing. The first opportunity is to follow the other regions into going into proportional representation, and to end the bipolar bit of Westminster, which is basically the win-lose adversarial thing, whereas all the other parts have moved into kind of collaborative. And so you change the electoral system, which can be done quickly without changing the regional governments. But then the picture, perhaps in 10 or 20 years' time, is where you have a new UK union government, which is exactly doing what we're saying, which is doing foreign policy, military, and macroeconomic policy, and then not meddling in regional stuff, but devolving the stuff which more correctly is done in the regions, just as it's more efficiently done in the other areas, because those areas, I think what Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland did is they related much better to their communities than London. And Britain was saved on COVID by the NHS and the people, not by the sort of despite Westminster, not because. So I think there could be a new future government, but I'm not seeing it as an English government. I'm seeing it as the new United Kingdom government, but 20 years on, with a different layering underneath and a much more democratic process.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all the speakers and for everybody who's been here. I know you haven't all had a chance to contribute, and one of the problems that is because of being on Zoom, I think, but the other is that the questions have been so complex that they have taken quite a long time to really answer with the depth that they deserve. So thank you very much, and especially thank you for coming all the way from Wales. Yes, so
thank you all, for amazing other speakers as well, fascinating. Thank you all. It's an honor to talk with you.
So hope to see you at the next debate. Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.
Bye-bye.